It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. BJ Newton. BJ is another high achiever in a string of high achievers today. She has a Bachelor of Arts, Honours in Sociology, a Bachelor of Social Work and a PhD in Social Work, Social Policy from the University of New South Wales. BJ is a proud Wiradjuri woman and currently works as a Research Associate at the Social Policy Research Centre within UNSW. BJ's current and recent projects are in the area of child protection, domestic and family violence, education, poverty and Indigenous policy. She has recently qualified for her PhD with a thesis titled Understanding Child Neglect from an Aboriginal Worldview, Perceptions of Aboriginal Parents and Human Services Workers in a Rural New South Wales Community. BJ also works part-time, I don't know how she has any part-time, as a domestic violence support and crisis response worker for the Sutherland Shire Family Services. Fantastic, welcome and thank you. BJ will be speaking today about understanding and responding to neglect in Aboriginal families.
Hi everyone. So before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation that we stand on today, pay my respects to elders past and present, and to extend that respect to our other Aboriginal colleagues here today, and also to acknowledge you guys for being here. So thank you, and thank you for having me. It's a real honour to be standing here and delivering my PhD findings with you guys, because it's such an important area that we really don't know very much about at all. Is that a clicky thing? Okay, clicky thing. This talk will present my the findings and implications from my PhD research, which explored Aboriginal parents and workers' views and experiences related to child neglect and parenting. The research was funded by the NHMRC, and I also want to acknowledge Barnardo's Australia for their continued support throughout the entirety of the project, even up until now. They provided me with resources, access to their clients, and in particular I really need to acknowledge Louise Voigt, who unfortunately has passed away, the former CEO of Barnardo. She was like my driving force throughout the PhD, so a wonderful woman and will be sadly missed. Okay. How does the clicky thing work? Oh, no, got it. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the community and a little bit of background to the research first. So the research took place in a rural community in New South Wales with a population of about 5,000 people. Aboriginal people comprised about a quarter of the overall population. The town had limited shops and services, there was no public transport within the town, and the nearest big regional centre was nearly an hour away. Many residents in the town experienced extreme social and economic disadvantage, and there was a high unemployment rate, and the town was experiencing an escalating drug crisis and had seen a rise in violence-related crime at the time that I went into the community, which was started from about the end of 2011. I conducted interviews in 2012. So before I entered the community, I sought permission from the Aboriginal Community Working Party at the time. It was the whole point of the PhD is about best practice in Indigenous research, and so to make sure that I upheld those principles. Firstly, I held an information session with the community. Asked them, what are the main issues in your community related to child neglect that you'd like to talk about. After that, I held 2 community forums. The first community forum talked about those main issues and teased out an appropriate interview guide for families in terms of sensitivities and to be able to tease out those main issues. And then I had a second community forum was held after I collected the data, and it was to interpret the findings from a community perspective. So it was me saying, this is what I found, why do you think I found this? This was surprising, what does this mean? And then I recently returned to the community a couple of months ago to deliver the final findings, and then to talk about, okay, here we've got the research, what are we going to do with it? And so there's talks about some really exciting things happening from that now. So I interviewed 18 Aboriginal parents and carers, 14 were mothers, 4 were fathers, and I also interviewed 9 human service workers from a variety of local organisations. I say variety, but the town's small and there aren't really many to choose from, but a variety. And 4 of the workers were non-Aboriginal and 5 were Aboriginal. And to just tell you a little bit about the families. They were mostly nuclear or one-parent families, and parents ranged from very young to being into the late 40s. Some had newborns and some had children that were up into their 20s. Some families were new to the community while others had lived there for generations. The participants experienced significant ongoing vulnerabilities such as drug and alcohol addiction, mental illness, family violence and poverty. Most families had experienced intervention from FACS, and several had had their children removed or had been removed as children. The way participants spoke about their Aboriginality varied, and there was a real complexity around the way people felt about themselves as Aboriginal and Aboriginal people more generally. Some participants were proud of their Aboriginality and they identified strongly, while for others there was more of a conflict. And that represents Aboriginal Australia more generally. You know, it's a real complex area, and it's really personal to each person. So views on child neglect were informed by a variety of factors, including people's experiences as children. So for instance, Tracy talked about her parents being drug users and that she was exposed to this as a child. She's against any drinking or drug use around her children, and she defined child neglect as letting the kids be in a dangerous environment. She also disclosed that as a new mum, she moved away from the family to avoid exposing her children to drugs and alcohol in the home. People's experiences as parents also influenced their views on child neglect. And a few talked about instances where they didn't take care of their kids properly and used this as an example of child neglect. So for example, Jasmine said, "I was being a neglectful mum. I didn't have any food in the house. The house was like a pigsty. You would have took the kids and put them in a tip. You may as well have. There were no beds in the house. I was taking marijuana and ice at the time. I was drinking like a bottle of whiskey whenever I could get the chance to, and there was abuse, yelling and screaming, fighting all the time, police coming to the home all the time." And community norms and expectations also influenced ideas of child neglect, such as the conditions where drugs or violence around children were acceptable, and I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. So there were 3 key concepts that were central to views on child neglect. The importance of fulfilling parental responsibilities to care for children appropriately, the idea that children should always be the first priority of their caregiver, and the role of parental intent in describing whether a situation was or was not child neglect. Parents also identified fulfilling parental responsibilities as going beyond meeting basic needs of providing food, clothing and shelter, and also included appropriate supervision, discipline and paying attention to your children. So parents spoke about child neglect as being the fault of the child's parent or caregiver, and generally had very high expectations of how parents should care for their child. Descriptions of child neglect focused on parental behaviour and their capacity and intention to meet children's physical needs. Parents' definitions didn't include the consideration of environmental causes such as living in high-risk and disadvantaged communities. That's interesting. It may be that it's just a normal way of life and they don't recognise that is an impacting factor. Whereas workers, while workers' views and parents' views were similar, there was differences in the way workers understood the cause of child neglect. So both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal workers emphasised that social disadvantage had a significant impact on quality of caring for children more generally, such as unstable housing, poverty, a lack of parental education and domestic violence. And this suggests that while there's little differences in the way workers and parents recognise child neglect, there's different explanations given to the cause of child neglect. It was also common that parents' views were inconsistent with their behaviours, and I'll talk a bit about that now. So despite participants' high parenting expectations, there's a significant contradiction that weaves through the findings, which is that parents harshly judge other parents for being neglectful, yet there's a high tolerance for risky behaviours such as violence and drug use. So, for example, parents overall agreed that exposure to drugs and alcohol was not a positive environment for children. However, some parents believe that children can still be well cared for despite having a parent who uses drugs or alcohol if they still function as a parent and put their children first. Some parents felt quite strongly about this and made comments such as, "The best parents I know are alcoholics or drug users." Parents also talked about too much drug use not being okay, meaning that it's acceptable to use drugs or drink alcohol as a parent, as long as it doesn't get to the point of impacting on the parenting. And I'd like to illustrate this with a couple of examples of how parents tried to ensure the safety and care of their children while still using drugs. So Tanisha said, "You don't take your kids out looking for drugs. Don't do that. If I say I'm going to get my methadone, I don't say that. I say I'm going to the hospital. I don't actually tell my kids, or they don't, like I don't take them there." Bree said, "Like my son never wanted for anything. I mean, I just weren't there in the present because I was always on the drugs. And you know, he had his nappies, his milk and everything, but my sister would always try and snap me out of it and be there present." So these comments show that there was a clear discrepancy in the views of parents whereby they acknowledge the potential risks of using drugs and alcohol around children, yet they believe that it doesn't have to be an indicator of child neglect. So like drug and alcohol use, perceptions of violence were also contradictory. Parents acknowledged the damaging effects of exposing children to violence and the need to protect children from it, yet there was a tolerance and a desensitisation to violence among the participants. Some parents talked about tolerating domestic violence if it was only once in a while. For example, Kelly said, "It depends on how often he does it. You know what I mean? Like some domestic violences are like every 3 or 4 months, you know, it's not every single night sometimes. Like I had a girlfriend where it was sporadic and they're good for a long period and then it snaps once and then it's good, do you know what I mean?" So this tolerating of domestic violence might have something to do with the idea that many participants, even those who escape domestic violence, believe that women had a choice to stay in the relationship. So, for example, Tracy said of her former relationship, "I didn't know really what he was capable of doing, and at the time I had no one over here and it was just me, like my mum didn't live here. So I guess I tried to go but I didn't try hard enough." So in terms of domestic and family violence being a form of child neglect, parents generally thought that if parents were trying to protect their children from it, then it was not neglect. It was also glaringly clear that violence was extremely common at a community level. Children were exposed to it in both private and public spaces, including at school, in the community and in the home. It's very much a part of everyday life for these families, so it's understandable to see how some participants could excuse domestic violence and wouldn't necessarily see it as being a form of child neglect. A good example of this comes from Lorraine, who was struggling with people vandalising her house and trying to bash her children. This is probably my favourite quote. She said, "Well, they keep telling me to go and put an AVO on them and everything like that. But why do that? You might as well start with the whole town." I think that just really reflects the sense of powerlessness and the struggle that these families face every day. So I want to stay with the issue of violence and use a case example to demonstrate intergenerational violence and community attitudes and responses to violence. So Lorraine was in a violent relationship for many years because she found it financially difficult as a single mum. She eventually left the relationship and expressed to me that although she can't give her kids the best in life, it's better than staying with her ex-partner, and she hoped that her children would not repeat her mistakes. Despite this, violence was ongoing within the family and a behaviour that Lorraine's children came to see as normal. She said, "My eldest one, when he was going to school, when he was younger, he hit me and I gave him 2 black eyes. I followed him to school and the teachers were going to ring the docs. I was right behind him and I said, well, if he wants to hit me, you can ring the docs. You know, I'd just done what I had to do, had to be a woman and a man, knock him down, and never seen docs that time." So this comment from Lorraine about needing to knock him down implies that she's come to see her son as the perpetrator of violence, like her husband, and needed to show her power in the relationship. After this incident, Lorraine's son was then beaten up at school by the other children when they learned that he had hit his mother, and Lorraine found this not only acceptable but justified. She said, "He deserved what happened, and he come home and he had a bleeding nose and bashed up face, and kids got stuck into him at school, you know. What can you do? Because they didn't like kids hitting their own mother, and the teachers agreed with me. I was honest about it. So Lorraine believed that the teachers and the school students validated her actions of giving her child 2 black eyes, which further depicts the idea that violence is a normalised experience in the community. And in this case, it was acceptable to punish violence with violence. Just a little bit on help-seeking behaviours and supports. So families were generally fearful of intervention from the government, particularly FACS, and this prevented some families from seeking help to address their needs. Karen said, especially when you go to places like Salvos and you think, oh, I don't want to go and ask them to help because his doc's going to find out, or just, especially when it's financial, you do get worried and you think that they think that I can't look after my kids. However, a lack of services and the prevalence of racism and discrimination in the town were also barriers to accessing the services that were available. So Yvonne, who was an Aboriginal family worker, she said, with the Aboriginal families, it's pretty hard around here to get houses or whatever else because you're Aboriginal. And if your family name is whatever, people target, oh, you're this family. But Aboriginal families have more, they have more struggles in life to get things done and get things achieved, like housing, Centrelink jobs. So participants also commented that Aboriginal people were treated differently by the police compared to non-Aboriginal people. So they said that Aboriginal people were more likely to be stopped and searched and less likely to be given a lift home. Real estate agents were accused by participants of withholding private listings for Aboriginal clients and providing them to non-Aboriginal clients. And at the local swimming pool, staff reportedly hassle and reprimand Aboriginal children more than other children. Many participants commented that staff in the supermarkets and retail shops follow people to be known drug users or criminals to make sure they don't steal anything. However, this is also commonly experienced by Aboriginal people. For example, Karen said, my word, I've walked in there and said to them, excuse me, will you stop peeking around the corner at me? Walk with me if you think I'm going to thieve. So Karen stated that she tries to explain this to her child, that he's not being picked on, it's just that a lot of Aboriginal kids steal and that's why he's getting watched. And she said to him, I'd tell him they're not really picking on him, they're just watching all the Aboriginal kids because a lot of them do thieve in there, and I'd just tell him the truth, that happens and that's why you're getting watched, mate. So Karen's response to her child demonstrates her desire to protect him from feeling victimised. During interviews, it was common that despite providing examples where they were being treated unfairly, when asked if discrimination was a problem in the town, the participants replied no. So I raised this finding during interviews with workers and during the second community forum, and everyone suggested that discrimination is such a normal part of the town culture that people experience it so often, it's normalised. And it also may be that Aboriginal people have internalised these negative stereotypes and in turn assume that they're true. So Karen said that this experience of being watched in supermarkets makes her feel uncomfortable and no good, but her comment to her child that they're not really picking on you and just accepting that that's the way Aboriginal people are treated, she doesn't identify it as discrimination. So these attitudes expressed by parents are an indication of the type of messages they're transmitting to their children. Some of these children will learn that it's normal and somewhat acceptable to be discriminated against. Others will think it's okay to make judgments and stereotype people based who share your own cultural background, or people more generally. And as many of the participants drew on experiences of being discriminated against in the community, their children will grow up feeling inferior and victims of unfair treatment. I'll now talk about some significant findings that are not really discussed in the child protection literature or in the service sector when working with Aboriginal families and communities. So first I'll talk about historical trauma, which refers to the ongoing and entrenched traumas that affect a group of people within a particular community. Over time, the legacy of trauma and accumulation of new traumas has a severe impact on the functioning of individuals and groups of people within the community and can span generations. Historical trauma manifests through violence and lateral violence, passivity and feeling powerless, low community cohesion and substance abuse. Social inequalities and social exclusion such as racism and poverty further compound the experience of trauma. So the impact of trauma was very obvious within families and the wider community. The majority of parents in the project were exposed to a range of vulnerabilities during their childhood, and most of these participants reflected that this exposure impacted them negatively in adulthood, and many have replicated these behaviours as parents themselves. And while many parents have committed themselves to avoiding these lifestyles, all still bear the emotional scars and resentment from these experiences, and for many they experience the guilt that they have at some point followed in their parents' footsteps. All the participants in the study shared the same desire to break these intergenerational cycles to provide a better life for their family in the future. This has occurred to varying degrees of success as a number of individual and social factors create challenges for the participants. For some, intergenerational parenting styles and behaviours have been so ingrained that parents may want to improve their situation, but they don't even know what the issue is to overcome it. So this is highlighted well in a case example of a young man called Nick. Nick was about to become a teen dad, and he came from a very violent home where his parents used drugs and alcohol. And I'll share with you some of our conversation where Nick acknowledges his parents' poor parental modelling, and he desires not to follow in their footsteps, yet without realising it, he displays violent behaviour. So I said to him, "And why do you think your dad is so angry and violent?" And he said, "Probably because his family come out violent." He said, "My dad taught me to grow up in like a violent way, but I never took that way. I'm sort of the person who's the quiet one, and my mum, she just does drugs and that, so I didn't follow her either." And I said, "So what are you going to do if somebody uses drugs around your child?" And he said, "Probably bash them." And I said, "Why do you think you'd be a good dad?" And he says, "Because I'm not like anyone else. Like, I would never hit a kid on my life. I'd never hit anyone younger or that. I've only hit people older than me, like 14 and up. I've never hit a 14 and down. I don't know why, I just don't like hitting people younger than me." And I said, "What else is there to being a good parent besides not hitting your kids?" And he said, "Sending them to their room, all that there kind of stuff. That's all I'll be doing with my kid." So you can see that Nick couldn't provide any examples of parenting outside of punishment without prompting. And it's not surprising considering Nick was unable to remember any happy memories from his own family. He believed that his parents cared more about drugs and alcohol than looking after him and his siblings. So trauma was also shown through lateral violence and powerlessness, which I'll talk more about now. So just briefly, lateral violence is the harmful behaviours that oppressed groups do to each other, more like taking it out on ourselves and taking it out on other people. And it can manifest in a variety of ways: gossiping, jealousy, bullying, shaming, physical violence, family feuding, exclusion, etc. And that's a really good reference from the Australian Human Rights Commission. So a key theme that strongly emerged from the data was that parents put each other down, or were feeling that people in the community generally put each other down. And this was expressed by internalised racism and by perpetuating negative stereotypes about Aboriginal people, and through being critical of other Aboriginal parents parenting in the community. So Mel said, "I tend to think that Aboriginal people, I am Aboriginal, I tend to think that Aboriginal people tend to neglect their kids more than non-Aboriginal families." And Lorraine said, "You see, a lot of people sort of don't care about their kids, and the parents, all they want to do is smoke drugs and too busy drinking and don't buy food." And as someone newer to the town from an outsider's perspective, Jasmine commented on people's attitudes towards one another. This is really insightful. She said, "I think there's a lot of judgment and a lot of backstabbing. I don't know if it's racism. Sometimes I think everyone has got nothing better to do but judge others, and I can't work out why you do it, because it's not like any of you that are doing the talking or doing the judgment are doing anything different to each other." So these ways in which parents are exchanging these negative attitudes towards one another are examples of lateral violence. In some instances, as explained by the workers, the lateral violence between families and people in the community is continuing in the schoolyard between children. So, for example, Carmen, an Aboriginal worker, said, "The kids, a lot of the time carry on what's going on between the parents or the cousins, and they don't even know about it, but I'm not allowed to talk to you, I can't mix with you." And Olivia said, "What actually happens is we get a term of bullying, say in the high school, that comes from the families, and the families are all involved in this external bullying." So when lateral violence and powerlessness are present in families and communities, it has a significant impact on children. They become exposed to, involved in, and victims of violence, drug and alcohol abuse, supervisory neglect, and a lack of aspirations for their future. Closely associated with lateral violence and historical trauma is the concept of feeling powerless. Everyone in this study generally felt powerless to address the issues in the town and over their lives, such as crime, drugs, alcohol, disciplining children and children wandering the streets, unemployment, their living situation, and government intervention. So Nadine commented on the community concern that no one's able to control the children in the town. She said, "See, where years ago when we were growing up, the police in this town were able to take you home or kick you up the backside or whatever, and have said to the parent, look, I've kicked her up the backside because she was out in the streets. Nowadays, God, please do that to these children and you're up for an assault. Jasmine commented on her own situation of feeling unable to control where she lives. Jasmine and her husband and child were placed in the town by Department of Housing recently. The area that she lives is a big drug area, and Jasmine, a recovering ice addict, was trying to work towards restoration of her older children. And she said, I was so angry with the Department of Housing for putting me here because they knew my situation. And I just took it because if I'm not going to get housing anywhere else, then I have no choice but to take this house. But I am angry with the Department of Housing because it's very hard. I come from this lifestyle of, yes, the drugs, and then you go and put me back in it again. Like, how does that help me? So previous literature has shown that when people are consistently exposed to unfavourable conditions and events in their environment, such as criminal and antisocial behaviours, people learn that they are helpless to control important life outcomes, such as where they live. This realisation creates a sense of powerlessness. Exposure to these social problems, particularly when perceived as beyond an individual's control to resolve, heightens parental stress levels and feelings of powerlessness, and this increases children's susceptibility to child neglect. So another main finding was that parents were raising their children without the support from their wider community, and while living around extended families had been the experience of most parents when they were children, many of these parents were now raising their children on their own or only with the support of a few close family members. At the same time, parents were reluctant to take responsibility for other people's children, for example, intervening if they see a child misbehaving in the streets. On the whole, there was little supervision of children in public spaces, and this signifies a shift away from traditional cultural practices for caring for children in all communities, or children in the community. As a result, children in the community were left to their own devices. Many children chose to go or to not go to school, to care for their siblings and to wander around town with groups of other children at their own discretion. In addition to a lack of parental monitoring, there was also a lack of community responsibility. Unlike traditional Aboriginal communities where members would collectively care for children, people in the town didn't help or intervene with other people's children for fear of negative repercussions such as abuse from the parent or the child. An implication of this is that children are lacking adult role models to guide them about adequate behaviours, culture and everyday life skills. Instead, children are turning on each other for support and looking to older children to model their behaviour. And this is concerning if these older children are engaging in risky behaviours as well. And it also means that children grow up without learning parenting skills themselves, and they miss out on learning about their culture. This finding is in stark contrast to the common belief that Aboriginal people live in communities where everyone takes responsibility and care for all the children. And I'd like to note that even though there wasn't a community approach to caring for children that I found, many parents expressed that they want this. They talked about wanting more community support and would appreciate other adults looking out for their children, as they would like to reciprocate, but they also said that in reality it was unlikely to happen. So in the second community forum, I presented this finding to the community, which was a group of workers, community members, and even some of the parents who participated in interviews. And I said, why are we seeing this shift away from traditional collective child caring practices? And they suggested a few reasons for this cultural shift. The first was that parents in the community were isolating themselves from the wider community because they didn't want to get mixed up in community problems such as violence, crime or drugs, or they were preoccupied with their own lives and problems. So when a community is increasingly high risk, as was a concern in this community, it's led to parents voluntarily disengaging from the wider community for the protection of their family and to maintain their own privacy. So, for example, Sue said, it's like you want to get out there and tell the kids, get home and this, that and the other, but you can't tell them to get home because I'm going to tell my mum on you, and then they'll be coming down and getting up you. It's like a no-win situation, I keep to myself as much as I can. Another suggestion is the possibility that many of the families are more isolated because they're not originally from that community. So even when families have lived in the town for years, as far as the community is concerned, it's not really that long at all. So they're not really considered members of the community, which contributes to their sense of isolation. Unless new people are introduced into the community as a friend or extended family, then to the elders and traditional owners, they're just like any other stranger living in that town. This was confirmed by several participants who had moved into the town up to several years prior to me interviewing them. So Mel said, I find that with the people that have been here for years and generations and decades, know each other and they've got more say-so type thing, if that makes sense. And Tanisha, by contrast, said, I feel like I can voice my opinion, like I'm part of the community, this is my town and I've got say over it. So here you have a group of Aboriginal people who come from different areas living together, some of whom are local to the area and some who are not. However, the fact that they're all Aboriginal people brings them together as a community, but it's not an Aboriginal community in a traditional sense where they are bonded by long-standing kinship systems. And this is really important for understanding the dynamics in the community. Another suggestion from the community was that the lack of focus on community caring for children is also a response to past government policies which removed children who lived in traditional extended family settings. And as a result, the children are not provided with the opportunity to learn from adults or their community elders. And this has contributed to the erosion of cultural knowledge and practices, resulting in the fragmentation of kinship ties and systems. And this is consistent with current evidence which shows that some Aboriginal families are reluctant to take on kinship care responsibilities when children are removed and placed in out-of-home care. And this is an example of the broader cultural shift of families living separately without a sense of kinship or community responsibility. An implication of this is it poses a significant barrier to the implementation of the Aboriginal placement principle, as a shortage of Aboriginal carers is one of the reasons that many Aboriginal children are placed in the care of non-Aboriginal families. The prominent influence of other environmental factors such as Western cultures and parenting norms, reinforced through service intervention, media and non-Aboriginal family and friends, must also be considered as a contributor to this cultural shift of families living in a less communal way. And this was evident in that parents didn't see themselves as parenting in a distinct Aboriginal way. In fact, they weren't consciously assessing parenting as aligning with any culture at all. So regardless of the reason why parents were isolating themselves, the fact remains that these families don't feel supported. This questions the assumption that Aboriginal families generally have the support of their communities and extended families to help raise their children. And this is important for services to know because it means that Aboriginal parents may be more isolated and more in need of formal supports than expected. So there's just a summary of the findings, which I might just skip. I assume I'm running out of time. So just in terms of conclusions and key messages, child neglect is a reaction to the circumstances within the family, the community and the social environments, as opposed to bad parenting or intergenerational trauma alone. The issue is not that Aboriginal views and expectations of parenting or child neglect are different to FACS or services or non-Aboriginal families. Rather, it's the situation that is preventing parents from meeting these expectations that's the real issue. The research revealed a number of factors within families and the community which perpetuate social disadvantage and are ongoing and difficult to overcome. I argue that this is particularly because of an overwhelming sense of powerlessness experienced by individuals but also prevalent at the community level. Parents demonstrated that they do not accept child neglect and they are acutely aware of how to parent well. They just need the structural and social supports, self-empowerment and safe and accessible service systems to help them meet their children's needs. This finding that Aboriginal families in the community don't have a collective approach to parenting highlights the need for services to reserve making assumptions about how families may live or how communities may interact based on their cultural background. Parents in this research didn't explicitly state that they parented in an Aboriginal way or a non-Aboriginal way. This indicates that the way parents perceived their own parenting was not focused on cultural parenting styles, and so the extent to which being Aboriginal has a role in their parenting is difficult to disentangle from other factors. This raises considerations for service intervention when engaging with families. Child protection agencies attempt to be culturally sensitive to the norms and practices of other cultures. However, workers may carry their own assumptions about the way Aboriginal people parent and care for their children. This research has found that this group of Aboriginal parents don't really identify differences between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal parenting. Therefore, workers must be aware of this large diversity within cultural groups and be mindful of the different role of Aboriginal culture in the lives of families. Some families may identify proudly as being Aboriginal, but for whatever reason can't explicitly identify Aboriginal parenting norms. Instead, they're raising their children in a way that's much more consistent with Western practices. However, it's also important for workers to understand the impact of historical trauma and associated factors such as racism and discrimination. These are still prevalent for many families, so even though they don't see themselves as parenting in an Aboriginal way, being Aboriginal still has an impact on their parenting and other parts of their lives. So it's not just the actual parenting practices within the family that workers need to be conscious of, but how their cultural background may impact on their social experiences. And not parenting in a community setting may very well be to the detriment of families, as in being isolated, they don't have access to community supports and resources. And building these relationships between families in the community may be something that workers can assist with. And that's it, thank you.